After the violent confrontation between Indian and Chinese troops that has led to the loss of life of at least 20 Indian soldiers, the question to be asked now is what should be India's response? Now, of course, at the political level, strategic, and military level, the people in charge are going to be on top of this. But the one thing that we'd like to discuss today on this episode is with respect to trade. With the loss of life of our soldiers at the LAC, is it right to go on continuing with our trade status quo with China? I'm going to pose this question to Tushar Gupta.
Hi, Karan. Karan, very unfortunate what the events that transpired on Monday. First time in 45 years that the India-China border has seen such violence. Of course, the number of casualties on the Chinese side are pretty unclear. And going by how they actually were very transparent with their COVID-19 deaths, I don't expect China to come clean on this too. On the Indian side, of course, which should be of greater concern to us, we've lost 20 brave soldiers. It's a huge loss. And the one question everyone will be asking is, can we boycott China in terms of trade? Because every citizen now wants to contribute in this response to China. The military will do what it has to. The diplomatic channels will do what they have to. The politics will take care of itself. But what can the citizens do? And there's been this call for the boycott of Chinese products right away. Now, the problem is that the Chinese products, I have some notes with me. The share in India's total export and import are 9% and 18% respectively. So while we are not exporting as much as we should, we are importing a lot of stuff. The trade deficit is always in the neighborhood of $50 billion. And if you go by the total trade surplus China has with countries across the globe, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $420 billion. And India's it's in the neighborhood of 50 or $55 billion. So that's 1/8 of the deficit that we already share with China. But of course, if we today boycott the Chinese products, there's this notion that immediately the trade surplus will come down to zero. But things aren't always that simple. Should we boycott China when it comes to the products? Absolutely. Can we boycott it right away? I don't think so.
But why, Tushar? What do we have to wait for? You just mentioned about the dependency that we have on China and about the $50 billion trade deficit. Why not get started and cut on it right away? I mean, it can be a movement that Indians can partake in.
See, I'll give you some numbers here. Just stay with me. 20% of the auto components, 70% of the electronic components, and 45% of consumer durables, 40% of leather goods, and 70% of active pharmaceutical ingredients came from China. These are huge numbers. We talk about renewable energy all the time. The solar cells, 90% of them are coming from China. Just to give you some more numbers, 80% of the antibiotics imported by India, they come from China. 60% of the components for electronics, they come from China. You're right when you say that we need a movement. We need something to boycott. But here's the challenge. The dependency on China is such at this point, and it's India which is to blame for itself, because the last 30 years, while China was becoming the factory of the world, we did little to, actually do anything about capacity building. This is when you actually realize, these are the times when you actually realize that you should have invested more in capacity building. People talk about Chinese smartphones, people talk about the pharmaceutical industry, people talk about the chemical industry. All these industries are heavily dependent on China. While I very much sympathize and even endorse the idea of a movement where people can come together and boycott Chinese products, it's a little tricky. I'll give you a graph if you can put that on the screen. India also depends the most on Chinese imports for producing its own exports. So India, to create finished products which are later exported to other countries, there are raw materials needed for those. And 34% of those imports come from China. In fact, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, UK, they all constitute in the neighborhood of 3%. But China, it's 34%, Karan. That's a huge figure. So even what India exports depends on a lot on what India imports from China, right?
Right,
That
but Tushar, wait, let me just ask you this here. I mean, we're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and of course, right now we've had this Chinese transgression, but it's not like it has come out of the blue. We have been able to expect that this would happen. I mean, it isn't like their products are the only things that work on the market. I mean, we don't have to rely on the Vivos and the Oppos. I mean, surely as a part of developing local chains, we are going to be able to find the alternatives through the market. Otherwise, what we are doing is we are essentially just sponsoring them to inflict damage upon us, isn't it?
Well, in a way, yes. That's where I say we have been pushed against the wall. This is what happens when you do not build any capacity. And I'll take that Vivo Oppo point. Around 2014, the likes of Micromax, Lava, these were some national mobile companies. Today, Micromax is just making TVs, but they started with making mobile phones. They constituted a very greater part of the market share in India. They were making phones, even though they were importing components from China and assembling them in India. But they were at least up to something. Now, today, their share, the likes of Lava, Micromax, they're less than 10%, and mostly in the feature phone segment because the smartphones they produce, it's of very inferior quality. Now, I'll come to the Atmanirbhar point. I'll give you an example of the mobile phone market. Now, digital revolution has been a big part since Geo came in 2016. Everyone wanted a slice of that pie. A poor person cannot afford a Samsung or an Apple phone, Karan. And even though the Apple iPhone is assembled in China, it's incorrect to assume that a poor person can afford a smartphone, which they really want to, which is not from China. Vivo and Oppo, it's not only to the customers they have been able to offer those margins, even to the dealers, the people I talk to in the mobile markets in my city, they are very happy to endorse Vivo and Oppo because of the kind of commissions they get on selling those phones. While a company like Samsung, which I would honestly endorse, against a Chinese company, since Samsung comes from South Korea, Samsung pays the dealers on the basis of the volume. So if they sell an expensive phone, they have more money to make. That's how they give the commissions to the dealers. Vivo Oppo actually pay dealers to put up their hoardings, to market their entire brand, things like that. So that's one example. But if we talk about the mobile market, it's just not about Vivo and Oppo really current. 5G, it's coming up. After what happened on Monday, Huawei should be, not even be considered. Last year, after the informal summit in India between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, Huawei had been given the permission to run some trials. Now, that should not happen. Huawei cannot be a part of India's 5G future, not because of the data concerns, not because of anything else, but we cannot give such delicate access to a company which is in bed with the Chinese government, which is in bed with the Communist Party in Beijing. So that's one way. IoT is going to be a big thing in the future, Karan. Now, if we are dependent on cheap smartphones today on China, tomorrow we'll be dependent on them for cheap Fitbit gadgets, things like that. We need to stop that right away. So this is where the lesson is. You want to boycott? Absolutely boycott. But also ramp up the capacity building. 5G is going to be a thing. Why not look towards the West? Talk to the likes of Ericsson's, the Nokias. Tell them to come build in India. That's Atmanirbhar for you. IoT is going to be a big thing. People would want to have those smart wearables and watches and things like that. Endorse some national brands. Get some Western companies to produce in India. Now, where the problem happens, we do not have the infrastructure yet. The ports, the infrastructure, the skill training. This is what Atmanirbhar Bharat should really mean. Boycotting Chinese products won't give you the Atmanirbhar Bharat you're seeking, but ramping up your capacity building over the next 10 years until 2030, that's what Atmanirbhar Bharat, and that's what will give you an economic leverage against China. That's what you should be seeking.
Right, Tushar, from what you're saying, it's a bit discouraging because I'd like to ask you, what was our foreign policy doing all these years? I mean, shouldn't such a thing have been expected? That is one. And the second thing is, you're almost suggesting that we should assume a more defensive approach right now, given the situation. Is that what you're suggesting?
See, absolutely not. I'm not endorsing and India should have a defensive posture against China. The land we are defending in Ladakh, it should be defended at all costs. If it comes, we'll have to, of course, go for a trade embargo if situation spirals down south. But I'm talking about the long-term solution, Karan. What happened on Monday, it has reset. It has opened a new chapter in the diplomatic relationship between India and China. Things are never going to be normal again. Because until now, we were looking back at the 1962, 1967, and 1975, the wars and the transgressions that followed, the battles that followed. What happened on Monday, 2020, 15 June, this is going to rewrite history. So we need to start thinking long term. It might appear defensive in the short term. It might appear that, oh, I'm endorsing China's trade interest here. But in the long term, this is what's going to benefit India. And India needs to understand if it's sharing a 3,400-kilometer border with a country like China, they need to ramp up the capacity. They need to hold that economic leverage. Now, I'll give you an example of the pharma industry. Before the lockdown happened, our pharma industry is so reliant on China. The paracetamol, which is a common medicine used in every household, the raw material comes from China. Ajit Doval actually made this point very early in the first tenure of the Modi government, that the reliance of the APIs, that's active pharmaceutical ingredients in China, will come back to haunt us. And it's coming. Today, if we boycott China, this could be a problem, and this could indeed result in manufacturing problem in India, shortage of medicines. Long run, we need to look for new partners. We need to ramp up our national manufacturing. We need to look at alternative solutions outside China. But short term, we need to be a little rational. I'm not suggesting a defensive posture, but I'm suggesting a more aggressive posture in the long run.
Right, Tushar. Thank you so much for your insights. I think it's we've now come at a juncture where even the civil society has to play its part in terms of boycotting products.
Absolutely. See, in fact, the Confederation of All India Traders, very recently they released a list of products, and they said if we can create alternatives to these products, and they are actually planning to. These include some 450 broad categories of goods. They said we could cut down our trade deficit by $13 billion by December next year. So that's why the citizens are taking it up. I would insist that people come out. The ones who can should not go for Chinese products. For instance, Diwali is just 4 months away. People should not look for the Chinese lights. They shouldn't look for the Chinese diyas and things like that. Start there, start small. But in the long run, focus on the capacity building. That's where China is holding an advantage against us today. That is where we failed in the last 30 years. We shouldn't make that mistake again in the next 10 years. That's my only concern when it comes to the economic boycott.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights, Tushar.
Thanks, Karun.